best friend died in an accident. But at his funeral, I saw his wife, pregnant. When the call came, I already knew. I don't know how or why, but I felt it deep in my bones before I even answered the phone. Maybe it was the way it rang, shrill and insistent in the dead quiet of my apartment. Or maybe it was the uneasy weight that had been pressing down on me for days. Something I hadn't been able to name, but had felt lingering just out of reach. I almost didn't pick up. Maybe some part of me knew what was waiting on the other end, but my fingers moved before my brain could stop them. Tom. The voice was hesitant, unfamiliar for a moment in its quiet carefulness. It was Mark, Alex's younger brother. He and I had never been close, but something in the way he said my name sent a chill crawling up my spine. It's Alex. My stomach tightened. There was an accident. The pause that followed stretched too long, filled with something heavy and unsaid. Then, the words that changed everything. He didn't make it. A strange buzzing filled my ears. The room around me seemed to tilt slightly, as if the world itself had shifted just an inch to the left. What? I heard myself say, but my voice didn't sound like my own. Mark repeated it, softer this time, as if cushioning the blow would somehow make it hurt less. I didn't remember much of what he said after that. Something about a late-night drive, a sharp turn, wet roads, impact, no survivors, no survivors. I must have said okay at some point. I must have hung up, but I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the floor, feeling like I had fallen out of time. Alex was gone. Just like that. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was the kind of afternoon that made it hard to breathe. Thick gray clouds hanging low in the sky, the air damp and heavy with the unspoken promise of rain. It hadn't fallen yet, but you could feel it waiting, hovering just above the world, as if the sky itself was hesitating. People arrived in slow waves, dressed in black, their faces drawn and solemn. Some of them I recognized, old friends, co-workers, distant family members Alex had mentioned in passing but never talked much about. Others were strangers, their grief contained in quiet murmurs and careful nods. I stood near the back, watching, listening. Conversations hummed around me, soft and restrained. They spoke in low voices, as if anything louder might shatter the fragile stillness. Such a tragedy. So young. I still can't believe it. Neither could I. The casket stood at the front of the small chapel, draped in white flowers, an almost cruel contrast to the weight of death it carried. I couldn't bring myself to look at it for too long. It felt wrong. Like if I stared at it for too long, I might accidentally make this real. Then my eyes found Lily. She was standing close to the casket, her back impossibly straight, her face carefully composed. I had expected to see her shattered, undone by grief. But she wasn't. She was pale, yes. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with pressure. But she wasn't shaking. She wasn't leaning on anyone. She wasn't crying. There was something unsettling about her stillness, something about the way she held herself that made my stomach twist. And then I saw it. At first I thought I was imagining things. Just a trick of the fabric, the way her dress curved slightly differently than I remembered. But then she shifted ever so slightly and her hand moved, just for a second, brushing instinctively over the subtle swell of her stomach. My breath caught. Pregnant. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Alex never mentioned this, and that wasn't like him. We told each other everything, didn't we? The funeral ended, but the questions remained. I stood outside the chapel, watching as people drifted away in small clusters, their voices hushed, their eyes downcast. Some of them hugged Lily before leaving, offering quiet condolences, but she barely reacted. She nodded, murmured something polite, and kept her gaze distant, as if she was watching the world through a layer of glass. I couldn't stop staring at her. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind, a foreign thing that didn't belong here, in this moment, in the aftermath of Alex's death. It didn't make sense. He would have told me, wouldn't he? I thought back to our last conversation, just a few weeks ago. We had met for drinks, just the two of us, like we always did when life got too loud. He'd been quiet that night, distracted. When I'd asked what was wrong, he'd just shaken his head. It's nothing, man. Just some stuff with Lily. You guys okay? I had asked. He had hesitated, just for a second. Then he forced a smile, took a sip of his beer, and changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. Now I wished I hadn't. I waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before making my way toward Lily. She was standing alone near the entrance, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, I thought she might turn and leave before I could reach her. But then her gaze flickered to mine, and something unreadable passed through her expression. Tom, she said, her voice softer than I expected. Lily. I hesitated. I just wanted to say, if you need anything, I'm here. She exhaled, the kind of slow, measured breath that people take when they're keeping something inside. Thank you. A pause stretched between us. The air felt thick, charged with something neither of us was willing to acknowledge. I swallowed. Lily, not today, she said quickly, cutting me off before I could even ask the question forming on my lips. Not today, which meant she knew what I was going to ask, which meant there was something to ask. I nodded slowly, even as unease curled in my stomach. Okay, I said, though it didn't feel okay at all. She gave me one last look, something cautious, almost wary, before turning and walking away. I watched her go, the weight of unspoken words settling heavy in my chest. Alex was gone, but something told me his story wasn't over yet. The day after the funeral, I woke up with the same heavy feeling in my chest. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the grief. It was this growing sense that I was missing something important. Lily's pregnancy? Alex never told me, and that made no sense. We had been friends for years. He told me about every argument he had with Lily, every stupid little thought that crossed his mind. A baby? That wasn't something he would have kept from me, unless he didn't know. Or worse, he did, and there was a reason he didn't want to talk about it. I spent most of the day stuck in my own head, replaying our last conversations, looking for something, anything, that might explain what was going on. But there was nothing. Just normal messages, a few jokes, plans that never happened, no hint that anything was wrong. I needed answers. I met Mark that evening at a quiet cafe. He looked rough, worse than at the funeral. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles beneath them. He barely touched his coffee, just sat there staring at it. After a long silence, he finally spoke. It doesn't feel real. I nodded. Yeah. I hesitated, then asked, did Alex ever tell you that Lily was pregnant? Mark's fingers tightened around his cup. His expression barely changed, but I saw it, the flicker of hesitation before he answered. No. I leaned forward. But you knew. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. Lily told me, the night before the funeral. She just told you? I don't think she meant to. It slipped out. I frowned. Why wouldn't Alex have said anything? Mark hesitated again. They weren't doing great, he admitted. Something twisted in my stomach. What do you mean? They were fighting a lot. I don't know the details, but it was serious. Last time we talked, he sounded different, like he was done. A cold feeling crept up my spine. Done how? Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He was thinking about leaving her? I stared at him. Are you serious? He didn't say it outright, but I could tell. He wasn't happy. He told me things were complicated. Mark ran a hand through his hair. I told him to talk when he was ready, but that was the last time we really spoke. I sat back, my mind racing. Lily had stood at the funeral, calm and composed, accepting condolences like a grieving widow. But if Alex had been planning to leave her, what did that mean? And why the hell hadn't he told me? I couldn't let it go. It wasn't just grief or shock or even guilt. It was something heavier, something gnawing at the edges of my mind. There were gaps, things that didn't add up, things no one seemed to be questioning. I kept turning over what Mark had said. Alex was thinking about leaving. If that was true, then Lily's reaction at the funeral didn't make sense. She hadn't looked like someone who had lost the love of her life. She had looked controlled, like she had known it was coming, like she had been preparing for it. I needed to talk to her. Lily agreed to meet the next afternoon. I didn't have to push. When I asked, she just said yes, like she had been expecting it. We met at a cafe near her apartment, one of those places with too many plants and overpriced coffee. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked tired, but not broken. Her makeup was perfect, her hair neat. She was wearing black, still playing the part of the grieving widow. But there was something about the way she sat, back straight, hands folded neatly around the cup, that felt deliberate, like she wanted me to see her this way. I sat down across from her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she finally looked up at me. I knew you'd come. Her voice was calm, steady, not even a hint of hesitation. I cleared my throat. I just wanted to check in. She smiled faintly, like she didn't believe me for a second. That's nice of you. I hesitated, then went for it. Why didn't Alex tell me? Her fingers tensed slightly around her cup. Tell you what, you're pregnant. There was the slightest pause, a fraction of a second, but I saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes before she answered. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe he was waiting for the right time. That was a lie. Alex didn't wait to tell me things. He blurted them out too soon, if anything. That was who he was. Mark said he was thinking about leaving, I said carefully. Lily inhaled slowly through her nose. Did he? There was something unsettling in the way she said it. Not surprised, not hurt, just curious. Was he? I pressed. She tilted her head slightly, studying me. Then she sighed, setting her cup down. We were having problems, she admitted, but that doesn't mean he was leaving. I stayed silent, letting her talk. She shook her head, looking down at her hands. Things weren't perfect, but they never are, right? He was stressed. I was stressed. We argued, but we always worked through it. Her voice was soft, carefully controlled, like she had rehearsed this. Did he know about the baby? I asked. Lily's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw something crack in her expression. Fear. Then just as quickly, it was gone. She reached for her cup again, fingers steady. Of course he knew. Another lie. I could feel it now. That missing piece I had been circling. Alex hadn't known. And Lily was afraid of me figuring out why. Mark stared at me, his expression shifting between disbelief and something darker. Something closer to fear. You're saying, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You're saying you think Lily had something to do with it? I didn't answer right away, because saying it out loud made it real. Alex was dead, and if I was right, he hadn't just died. He had been silenced. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look at Mark. I don't know, but I think we need to start asking questions. Mark shook his head, looking around like someone might be listening. Dude, do you even hear yourself? This isn't a movie. People don't just... He hesitated, like he didn't even want to say it. People don't just what? I asked. Kill their fiancé? He gave me a sharp look. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. He was leaving her. He was done, Mark. And now he's dead. Mark looked away. You knew him, I pressed. You know this doesn't make sense. He didn't argue, because we both knew Alex, and we both knew that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night going over everything again. The letter, the funeral, the way Lily had looked at me when I asked about the baby, the way she had hesitated, the way she had lied. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing too close to something dangerous, like I had pulled the wrong thread, and now everything was unraveling, and I wasn't sure what I would find underneath, but I couldn't stop now. I decided to go to Alex's apartment. His parents hadn't touched it since he died. It was still technically his. His rent had been paid up for the next few months, and no one had the heart to start packing up his things. I still had a key. I didn't tell Mark I was going. I didn't tell anyone. I just went. The second I stepped inside, I knew something was off. It wasn't that anything had changed, it was that nothing had. The place was untouched, frozen in time. His shoes were by the door, his jacket still draped over the back of the couch. An empty coffee mug sat on the counter, like he had set it down and planned to come back for it. But he never did. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars outside. Then I started searching. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Signs of a struggle, a hidden note, something that said he didn't do this to himself. I moved through the apartment carefully, opening drawers, flipping through notebooks, scanning his bookshelves. Then I checked the bathroom, and that's when I found it. The pill bottle was in the cabinet, tucked behind some shaving cream. It was prescribed to Lily, not Alex. I felt my pulse spike. The label was for painkillers, the same kind listed in his autopsy report. I turned the bottle over in my hand, my brain running too fast to keep up. Alex didn't take pills. He hated them. So why the hell was a nearly full bottle prescribed to his fiancée in his apartment? And why had no one thought to check that? I stood there gripping the bottle so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then I put it in my pocket and left, because now I had proof. And I wasn't the only one who knew.